Welcome and thank you for joining us for the 5th North American Congress for Conservation Biology. My name is Karen Root, she, her, and hers, and I am the SCB North America President. We're very excited about our theme of crossing boundaries, and I hope it sparks some interesting conversations this week. I'm going to keep my remarks quite brief so that you can hear from a lot of other important voices. But I need to thank some people, tell you why this event is important, and highlight a few features of our conference. Next slide. So it's been a unique challenge this year. You can go to the next slide. And we have had to move from extensive planning of an in-person conference to a completely virtual one. We appreciate your patience with the transition and throughout the week. Let me start by thanking all the hardworking people that have made this conference possible. In particular, my co-chair, Becky Huff from the Denver Botanical Gardens, and Megan Kevel, our Director of Operations. Their dedication was invaluable in making this event happen. In addition, we also have a dedicated local organizing committee, which is shown here and also listed on the website. They were flexible and instrumental at helping us adapt to this new virtual format. Next slide. And of course, you have also elected a strong North American board of directors, and they were integral to the planning and implementation at all stages. You'll get a chance to hear from many of them during our members meeting on Wednesday, which I hope you will join. We want to tell you a little bit more about what SCB North America is doing and get your feedback. So when I say we, just know that I speak on behalf of a great group of people that deserve all the credit. Next slide. My final set of thank yous goes to our generous sponsors and partners, especially the Denver Botanical Gardens. Believe it or not, virtual events are quite costly to put on, and we are extremely grateful for all of their financial support. Welcome from all of us, and thank you for participating. Next slide. As you know, we'd hoped to be greeting you from the great city of Denver, but circumstances certainly changed since our initial planning. There have been a lot of challenges and sorrows this year, which makes it even more important for us to convene as a conservation community, even if it is only virtually. I encourage you to use the week to connect, engage with the conservation community, listen to others, argue a little bit, find new collaborators, and learn something new. Personally, I find that these conferences make me feel supported and empowered to continue striving towards our shared conservation goals, despite all the continual challenges and changes in our environment. Please read and abide by the code of conduct so we can make this meeting as inclusive and productive as possible. But most importantly of all, actively participate. Next slide. Let me just say that we worked very hard to develop an interesting and engaging conference, and we hope it challenges you to interact across those boundaries, whether they're disciplinary, geographical, political, or identity-based, and think innovatively about conservation. Just to provide a few highlights, we have a great set of plenaries, starting with today's, and then one on tomorrow and Thursday. There's also a draft policy statement on connectivity that you will have a chance to shape and vote on in the members' meeting. Just a reminder that all the talks and the posters for the contributed sessions are pre-recorded, so you'll need to view those before the live Q&A for each session. We also have some great interactive sessions and networking events. Check the program to see all of the variety of things that you can participate in. And then we'll also be ending the conference with a special remembrance event for one of our founders, Dr. Michael Soule. Next slide, please. And now I'm going to turn it over to Yufna Soldier-Wolf for our land acknowledgement. Thank you.
Hello, relatives. My name is Yufna Soldier-Wolf. I am thankful to be here today for the Ancestral Territory Land Acknowledgement. The state of Colorado has tribes from the Arapaho, Cheyenne, Southern Ute, Mountain Ute, High Plains, Apache, Comanche, Pawnee, and Kiowa. Next slide, please. I would like to start this land acknowledgement by sharing a prayer that my father has come up and has shared with me while I have been growing up. This prayer is the sacred ground. Bita awat gavhod. This land is sacred. What is used and what is taken from her is always given back. To live upon her is a blessing. To go against this is unthought of and unnatural. Nuhu bita awat betanta hat do hina. Hatchake nitani don hat nitani hatchake hina. Don hasin nitani hatchabaske hina do baki wahaka dadada hatin nasa. Next slide, please. With Colorado being our ancestral territory for the Northern Arapaho, I thought I would share an important map that is important to my ancestral migration for the Arapaho amongst the other tribes. This is a map from a treaty map from 1851 to 1868. It is important to acknowledge our ancestral land for these stories of creation stories that we have tribally connect us back to borders of Canada, to the Rocky Mountains, to the Great Lakes, down to Texas. Next slide, please. In 1878, we were forcefully settled. Sorry about that. We were forcefully taken from Colorado and settled on the Wind River Reservation. We were once in Colorado State with the Arapaho and Shoshone. Those lands, Cheyenne, those lands were ceded into Colorado. Next slide, please. With the ancestral knowledge and knowledge that's been passed down to us through traditional ecological knowledge, a lot of our war leaders at this time in 1877 and 1878 from the Hinana-Edin Arapaho tribe, these war chiefs were basically the first advocates and our people were the first scientists. So I share that information a lot. Next slide, please. Traditional ecological knowledge for Indigenous people is equal to conservation biology, along with water conservation. We are taught early that water is important, that this water is sacred, and it gives us life through plants, animals, and insects. Without it, life would be impossible. Our ceremonies are based on two things, stars and water. We don't play with it, we don't splash with it, we treat it with the highest reverence. Next slide, please. Traditional ecological knowledge for Indigenous people, like I said, was equal to conservation biology. We still have this knowledge and we like to share that knowledge through science-based classes. One thing I've learned through my entire life has been ecosystems, and learning how to keep those ecosystems going in ancestral territory through star knowledge, plants, waterways, animals, animal corridors, and insects. Next slide, please. Lastly, I want to talk about disenfranchisement. When the Arapaho were escorted off of Colorado when the land was taken, I was always told when you remove people from the land, they lose their stories and connections to the ancestral lands. And we lose the opportunities to reconnect. The Arapaho, amongst other tribes, coming back to Colorado is vital conservation and a managing method. These methods could quite possibly preserve land and revive lost ancestral science, vital to inclusion of tribal decision-making during a vital time of climatic change. Next slide, please. I would like to thank the conference committee for inviting me in Cache La Porte Heritage Site, and I would like to pass it on to the president. Thank you and haho.
Wonderful. Thank you, Yufna. First, I wanted to start with a congratulations to Karen, Becky, and Megan, and all the conference organizers for pivoting to this virtual format so successfully. We all really appreciate getting together in any way we can. Next slide. The Society has come a long way since Michael Soule and his colleagues founded it in 1985. Sadly, Michael died last month, and he will be missed as a mentor and a champion for the conservation of all species. We will be continuing a small grants program for the Society for Conservation Biology's chapters. These are our grassroots groups working to conserve nature, and we see your work as an extension of his vision for the Society and are happy to offer Soule's Saving Species Small Grants Program for chapter activities in honor of Michael. Next slide. SCB is accepting nominations for our next president and vice president for membership. We all know, especially right now, that leadership matters. So please help us recruit some great candidates for these important positions. I also want to mention some wonderful new member benefits, including an opportunity to learn more with Wild Team from the UK. And we're giving particularly nice discounts for these very useful trainings. So check out our website for that, as well as announcing the Smith Fellows call for proposals. So if you're an early career scientist interested in a fellowship, these are an excellent opportunity, and we can't thank the David Smith Conservation Research Program enough for this wonderful opportunity. And congratulations to all the past Smiths, and good luck to future Smith Fellows. And all this information and more can be found on the Society's website. Next slide. Well, the Society is in an interesting time, and I think an exciting time. So we're assessing the current organization and co-designing a new structure with NRhythm to advance our global network and collective impact. If you receive an organizational health survey from NRhythm, please fill it in to help us with the first step of this important process. We really welcome your full participation in this organizational assessment and restructuring process. Next slide. After enjoying this virtual conference, we hope you'll consider registering for another one and learning more from your colleagues from around the world. So we have the upcoming Marine Conservation Congress, which is going to be virtual, as well as the Conservation Latin America 2020. So I hope to see all of you at these as well. Next slide. And jump in and help the International Congress for Conservation Biology, ICCB 2021, is coming to Kigali. We're really excited about this. It's a great opportunity to connect with the African section members and take advantage of the international network that SCB offers everyone. Next slide. And lastly, I do want to welcome and thank the organizational members of the Society. We appreciate your interest and support in the Society's mission to advance the science and practice of conserving Earth's biological diversity. And now take it away to Chris Schell, who is on the faculty as an urban ecologist at the University of Washington in Tacoma. Thank you.
Thank you, Adina, for the awesome introductions. Again, my name is Chris Schell. I'm an assistant professor of urban ecology at the University of Washington, Tacoma. And today I have the honor and the privilege to introduce our plenary, a new paradigm of high impact research, why conservation science needs to prioritize racial and social justice. To give you guys an understanding of how this particular plenary session is gonna go, we first have our awesome keynote speaker, Dr. Carolyn Finney, and I will introduce her in a little bit. I would like to also thank my other co-organizers for this particular plenary session. So Drs. Kim Terrell, Rebecca Tonietto, and Max Lambert, who have been instrumental in helping us pull this together. We quite literally were building the plane as we were flying it. So thank you all to the other co-organizers and to all of the speakers that we're going to have for the plenary today. So really briefly here, the science and practice of conservation have largely failed to address systemic racism and social inequality. Rather than being unrelated to the mission of biological conservation as historically viewed, these issues directly shape conservation efforts and their outcomes. In this plenary, we bring together diverse perspectives to create a new definition of high impact research. Through a series of short talks followed by an interactive panel discussion, we will start an honest dialogue. one that we envision will stimulate powerful action to address racism and inequity in conservation. So essentially, we'll have the keynote address by Dr. Carolyn Finney. We will then progress into pre-recorded talks from many of our panelists and speakers, including myself. From there, we will break into a panel discussion. During this entire period of time, as we are watching many of these awesome talks, I should remind you all that we have a hashtag on Twitter. If you're on Twitter, called Inclusive Conservation, use that hashtag as much as possible, amplify these different eclectic, awesome, amazing voices in this particular plenary session. It should also be noted that if you have questions as you're listening to the talks, you can submit those questions, but we will be holding those questions until the end of this plenary session and then addressing those questions as moderated by Sean Watts. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Carolyn Finney. Carolyn is I can't express to you guys enough how excited I am to have Carolyn speak with us today. Carolyn is a storyteller, an author, and a cultural geographer. She is deeply interested in issues related to identity, difference, creativity, and resilience. Dr. Carolyn Finney is grounded in both artistic and intellectual ways of knowing. She pursued an acting career for 11 years, but 5 years of backpacking trips through Africa and Asia and living in Nepal changed the course of her life. Motivated by these experiences, Carolyn returned to school after a 15-year absence to complete a bachelor's and master's in gender and environmental issues in Kenya and Nepal, and a PhD where she was a Fulbright and a Canon National Science Scholar Fellow. Along with public speaking, writing, media engagements, consulting, which she works with a variety of environmental, educational, and arts-based nonprofits and government agencies, and teaching at Wellesley, UC Berkeley, and the University of Kentucky. She served on the U.S. National Parks Advisory Board for 8 years, which assists the National Park Service in building relationships of reciprocity with diverse communities. Her first book, which if y'all haven't read it, you need to read it like yesterday, Black Faces and White Spaces, Reimagining the Relationship of African Americans to the Great Outdoors, was released in 2014. Recent publications include The Space Between the Words, 1,000 Oceans, This Moment, Self-Evident, Reflections on the Invisibility of Black Bodies in Environmental Histories, and The Perils of Being Black in Public, We're All Christian Cooper and George Floyd. She is working on a new book, creative nonfiction, that explores identity, race, lived experience, and the construction of a Black environmental imaginary, a performance piece about John Muir, which is aptly titled The N-Word, Nature Revisited, and is a contributor for an upcoming anthology, A Darker Wilderness, an anthology of Black nature writing, to be published by Milkweed Editions. She was privileged to do a month-long residency at the Blue Mountain Center in New York in 2018 and was the artist in residence for the Kentucky Foundation for Women's Fall Residency Program in 2019. Without further ado, again, I would like to introduce the awesome, incomparable Dr. Carolyn Finney. Carolyn, go ahead and take us away.
Who can follow that introduction? All right, that was pretty fabulous. Can we hear that again, please? No, I'm kidding. No, Chris, thank you so much. I want to let you all know when you see me look down, I'm just looking at my notes to kind of keep me on time here. First of all, I want to thank Kimberly Terrell for reaching out and inviting me to participate today. I want to thank the sponsors as well as everyone on the committee who decided that they would like to have my voice be part of this conversation. I've always wanted to build a public platform to talk about race, difference, the environment, whose knowledge counts, whose stories count, and why that matters. So what's so funny, of course, as we all know in this moment, that is up for a lot of people and a lot of groups, and it's a hard conversation to have. So I'm not even going to pretend, right? I'm not even going to front. It's a hard conversation to have. So I thank all of you for making the space and for leaning into this today. Oh, and while I was talking, I was going to put up a slide because I can. So I'm going to do that right now because I made it. Yeah, I wanted to have that there. So I call today's talk The Reckoning, Race, Conservation, and Keeping It Real. Because I really, part of this for me is how we talk about this. How do we feel this moment? I struggled deciding what to talk about today because there's so much that I want to say. So first I'm going to say I'm not a conservation biologist. You know this. And while I have a doctorate degree in geography, effectively allowing me to claim being a social scientist, that space is not the space I claim as the primary space I like to stand in. Like many of you, I've been many things, and I am defined by what I do. So in no apparent order: actor, student, waitress, wife, backpacker, professor, friend, researcher, environmentalist, writer, speaker, the list goes on. But as a wise friend of mine likes to remind me, we are human beings, not human doings. And while what I do influences how I see myself in the world, two facts remain true. One, that I am human. And two, I am Black. You know, we could have a conversation about gender, and I see that as being fluid, so we'll leave that to the side for a second. I just want to say, one, that I am human, and two, that I am Black. And in all the spaces that I do what I do or did what I did, I can never forget that. I can never be, as I like to say sometimes, incognito. It doesn't matter what I'm doing, whether I'm shopping, hiking, doing research, teaching, driving, I am always Black. And I'm always reminded about that all the time. Like Christian Cooper, who had the color of his skin weaponized against him by a white woman, Amy Cooper. I never know when or how it may be used against me. I know it's hard to hear, but we have to stand in it because it never goes away. It doesn't go away at a conference or a meeting or when you walk into a room where you're the only one who looks like you. It never goes away. So what do we do with that? You've got to be able to see a thing to know a thing, and you've got to know a thing in order to be able to change a thing. You've got to be able to acknowledge a thing in order to grasp your own and your community's culpability and complicity. And here's the thing, I think we're all culpable and we're all complicit, not just in the same way at the same time, but we're all culpable and complicit. And I know we want to talk about strategies, and we can have that conversation. But if this moment is telling you nothing else, it is that we've always been here. And while many of us, myself included, often privilege our intellect as a way to know the world, we also know the world through our emotional, physical, and spiritual strivings. So we need our whole selves right now. I want to say it again. We need our whole selves right now. I need not only your intellectual brilliance, but I need your heart. I need you to feel what it's like not to be able to breathe. I need you to feel what it's like not to be able to breathe. Not only when a police officer has his knee on your neck, but when you are denied your full humanity in the classroom, the conference room, on the written page, in your job, and in the elevation of certain knowledge and narratives that obscure or erase other ways of knowing and being in the world. I know I said it was going to be hard, but you know, you got to say the things like this, right? Because I think this is where we're standing right now. We need to keep it real. So a couple of things about me, right? I call it being self-evident. Also, I often say that it's always so interesting to talk about a thing when you are the thing itself. This work, this moment, this conversation is personal, it's political, it's intimate. And I actually hope and think that it should be that for everybody. But I can say for me that it's personal, it's political, and it's intimate. And I'm biased, just like everybody else. I have bias, which isn't the same as prejudice, which isn't the same as racism, but they certainly exist in close proximity to one another. And I know that science uses different methods and skills and rigor to address bias in one's work. But how does that work in real life? How does that work when we're talking about race? Whose data, whose story counts? So I often like to talk about, you know, if I'm in an academic setting, you know, why I wrote the book, Black Faces, White Spaces, right? So when I had gone back to school, and so this is early 2000s, I was working on my dissertation. I had gotten a Fulbright. I was supposed to be looking at conservation issues and gender in Nepal. And it was 2001, and a lot of things happened there, right? 9/11 happened. The royal family in Nepal got assassinated. I got over there, and then the Maoists broke a ceasefire that had been in place for a long time. I was supposed to be doing my work in the Annapurna Conservation Area. At the end of the day, I was only able to get out to the field twice in 7 months, and for a matter of maybe a total of about a week and a half. So what was obvious is that I wasn't going to be able to finish writing this. And so I came back home and said, I'm going to shift my dissertation. I'm going to write a whole new proposal. I've been thinking a lot about race and the environment in the United States. And in particular, I've been thinking about African Americans and the environment. And when you're working on your dissertations, what's the first thing you do is you go to the library. I want to see what was on the library shelves at my university. And there was very little on the shelves about African Americans and the environment. There was some significant work on environmental justice, right? So if I'm going to be really glib about it, I will say the bad things that happen to Black people in nature. You know, no group is only the bad things that happen to them, but there's some significant work there. But there wasn't anything else. I couldn't go to the nature section, the biology section, the memoir section. I couldn't go to any other section of the library and find anything else on African Americans. And I started thinking, what does this mean? Does it mean we don't care about the environment? Does this mean we don't matter? Does it mean we have nothing to say or contribute? What does it mean? The reasons why I was finding so little became almost as important as the substance of the research itself. And it was timely for me. Just because there was nothing on the shelf doesn't mean that Black people weren't producing knowledge about ourselves. We may not have been able to participate in traditional spaces of knowledge production, but we were definitely producing knowledge, music, art, memoir. It was out there. I just needed to read the data differently and understand how to weave it together with more traditional data about the environment. And this work is constant. It is a skill set. It is a practice that we hone and must continuously pay attention to, particularly when we are talking about diversity. Something different from the norm, the accepted, the status quo, the privileged, and the understood. Well, and that means we're juggling the power of that. I'm not even, I can't even pretend here that it's about getting clever and pulling out some different kinds of knowledge, because you always have to fight for that knowledge to have space and for it to count in the same way and for it to be heard in the same way. And why? What's going on really? I remember a comment a co-faculty member of mine made about my work at UC Berkeley that they wrote down. We don't understand the value of you citing Zora Neale Hurston or Spike Lee in your work. Now, not only does that tell me they may not know who Zora Neale Hurston or Spike Lee is, but actually what they're saying is we don't understand the value, therefore it has none, right? So when we start to talk about bias, what is privileged, what is comfortable for people, how do we change and push back on that? And for me, it's not one or the other. I mean, we're too smart for that. We've had too much experience for that. I believe it's not an either or, it is an and. And how do we think about what that looks like? I want to say to you that, and only briefly, the other thing that sort of informs my bias, and many of you have heard me tell this story, is that I had grown up on an estate 30 minutes outside of New York, an estate that belonged to a very wealthy Jewish family, an estate that my parents were, that was their job, to care for that estate. The wildlife on the estate, the lake on the estate, the vegetable gardens, the fruit trees on that estate. They lived in the gardener's cottage and raised me and my brothers there, and they did that work for nearly 50 years in a very wealthy, all-white neighborhood, taking care of that land for 50 years. Their labor and love and their blood and sweat is embedded in that. And the thing that happened to me at the time I was working on this dissertation that really brought it home how personal this is for people, right? How personal this is for me was that when we left and had to leave, the original owners died, a new owner came in, my parents had to leave, and they moved back to Virginia, was that when a group called the Westchester Land Trust decided to put a conservation easement on this property, and when they placed an easement on this property, it meant in perpetuity, everything would be protected. Nothing would be changed. And they sent a letter out to the community, and I have a copy of that letter, to let them know why they were protecting this property, the conservation values of this property, where this property sits in the watershed, right? All the species on this property, the importance of protecting in that. And at the end of this letter, which was about a page and a half long, it thanked the new owner for his conservation mindedness. He'd been on the land for 3 years. And there was nothing, excuse me, in the letter thanking my parents, even acknowledging my parents, who'd cared for that land for 50 years. And just that fast, they were erased from the environmental history. Just like that. And that's what I'm thinking about all the time in this country. All the people, particularly the Black and brown people in the history of our country, who have always been there, who continue to be there, to contribute, create knowledge, engage in conservation in a wide variety of ways, but they are erased, they are invisible, they are ignored. And for that, we all lose. So I come to it from that perspective. privilege has the privilege of not seeing itself, right? This is not about the land, the Westchester Land Trust being about bad people. And for me, bad and good serves no purpose here because we all have that capacity. It is actually the way in which privilege operates. It's actually the way in which white privilege operates. Whiteness is not a bad thing, but it is about power. And to understand the ability to not see the people right in front of you doing the work. They don't have degrees, they don't have the money, they don't actually have ownership, but they're there anyway, and they've always been there. And again, what do we all lose when we don't see that? So I made a little list today, knowing that I wouldn't be able to get through everything, but hopefully it'll come up in our conversations. A few things that I'm hoping that we'll talk about. I wrote, and in no apparent order, looking good versus doing good. How at this moment, every company, institution, and organization that wants to be sure they're saying the right thing. But are they ready to do the right thing? And do they actually know what that means? And do they know what that requires? I've been thinking about accountability and responsibility. What risks are you willing to take in order to gain? This isn't about taking a risk, you know, putting something out there, saying we're down or ready to do the work because you're afraid you're going to lose something, your brand, your place in the community, whatever it is you're afraid you're going to lose. It's about taking a risk in order to gain something else, that thing we can't quite see yet. The race card. So I bring this up, I have to just say that I have had more than once in my life, a well-meaning white person or being in a group, doing this work, having these conversations, look at me and say, why do you always play the race card? And for me, what that partly means is they're kind of lobbing the issue back over to my court as though it's my problem, my issue. It is actually our problem and it is our issue. And so how do we decide how to tackle that? Again, that we're all culpable and complicit in different ways. Diversity. I wrote down here for myself, diversity, what are you talking about, Willis? Diversity is not assimilation, appropriation, extraction, or transaction. I want to say that again. Diversity is not assimilation, appropriation, extraction, or transaction, right? It is about relationship. It's not about outreach, right? And people have heard me say this, I don't even use the term anymore. It's not about bringing me to your table, then expecting me to learn about the mission statement, the way you do everything, adjust to the culture, but everyone at the table doesn't have to do everything, right? That's not a relationship of reciprocity. And what does a relationship of reciprocity look like? And what does it require? And what does it demand? It's about building internal capacity, attending to the impact of your good intentions. I believe most people go into this work with a good heart. I believe that. I actually believe that about people. But privilege, again, has the privilege of not seeing itself. And your good intention isn't enough to get you through. And what does it mean when you make a mistake? And you will. If you haven't already, you will. Why? Because you're human. But how do you show up after that? What does that look like to show up? You know, we've been making mistakes for 400 years. One could argue Christopher Columbus made a mistake, and I won't even go there. And we're still dealing with the consequences of that, right? Good impact or not, because it really depends on who you ask, right? Diversity is not an outcome, it's a process. Everyone has to change, adapt. Hiring one diverse person and expecting them to carry the load, the inability to value and evaluate diversity work. Think about that in terms of promotion, curriculum, change. Who does the work? Students, who's doing the work? How is that work seen and valued? How is it supported? How is it shared, right? And what about supporting the emotional labor that goes into the work, right? Emotion, for me, and emotional ways of knowing isn't anything any less than intellect. And again, that's why I asked you in the beginning, our whole selves need to be here. I can never come in the room without my whole self. Not even if I wanted to, I couldn't do it because something will remind me about my whole body in that space. So why fight it? Let's lean into it and see where that takes us. I wrote here, who and how we hire, promote our curriculum, our methods, the narratives we tell, the ones we discount, the voices we privilege, and the ones we ignore. You don't have to throw out the baby with the bathwater, but maybe you need a new bathtub, really, right? This isn't about getting rid of everything that we had before, but it certainly challenges the container and the frameworks and the infrastructures that we privilege and that we have now. You cannot expect to get to and have a more diverse experience without actually being willing to give up some of what we have now and changing the way that we do things now. And let me tell you, I always say to people now, if you're comfortable, you're probably not doing the work. Really, I'm just saying it, because this isn't about being comfortable. I thought of a radio show I heard on a couple of years ago on NPR with Michelle Martin, and she was interviewing Belarusian journalist Svetlana Alexievich, who had just won a Nobel Prize for her literary work on Chernobyl. And what Michelle was saying to her was that, well, you know, you kind of pissed off a lot of people back in Belarus. A lot of your own people are really upset with you. You've made them really uncomfortable. And what Svetlana Alexievich said in response was, her purpose, she says, is, quote, that she loves her country and wants it to be better instead of comfortable with where it is. This isn't about being comfortable with where we are. There is a lot of us that have never been comfortable. And I believe we should never be comfortable with where we are, right? Because I find that to be problematic. But here's the thing, you can be uncomfortable, that's okay, because you've got a lot of us who've never been comfortable and we have become pretty adept at doing this work. It doesn't mean that we should be doing all the work. It just means that we can be thinking about that together. So I think a lot about internal assessment as well, right? Internal assessment for organizations, agencies, but always individuals. We are always talking about individuals, right? So I put this slide up because I'll tell you something about where a lot of my own work lies that I have to continually do. So the story of the older white man that you see there in the picture, this was a few years ago. His name is Ian Gibson. Ian Gibson was self-identified as a 53-year-old white sports hunter. And the story talked about how he liked to go to Africa and hunt elephants for sport. And I got to tell you right off the bat, I'm severely biased against this. Actually, I'm kind of prejudiced against him about this. I don't understand sport hunting, why you'd want to put an elephant head on your wall. I love elephants, I just don't get it. The story talked about how he went over. He was joined by some Black African men and some other white men as well. They went out sport hunting in Zimbabwe. He got too close to a bull elephant and it gored him to death. So as I'm reading this online, I then fell into what I call like the black hole of the comments. And you all know what I'm talking about, right? You kind of fall in and then you come out like an hour later, like what just happened. The thing for me is when I came out of all those comments, I was near tears because all of them, save for one, were brutal. They said things like he got what he deserved. One for the elephant. And it just went on like that. There was one that talked about compassion. And here's what I thought. I said, this is where I do the work because this man died a horrible death. I have no doubt it was horrible. He has a family, he comes from a community. He's a fully realized human being. What would it mean for us to sit down with each other and work across those differences and have these hard conversations and get good at it? What would that look like? So I have to spend time working on my empathy and compassion and expanding my ability to engage across difference over here. I put the picture up against the other picture of a young African-American boy. It was connected with a story having to do with Flint, Michigan and the lead in the water. And I put it up against that story because I don't have to do any work over here. You know, this is a story about politicians and other adults who knew that there were lead in the water and ignored it anyway, and it's going to be impacting particularly the children. We don't know for how long, right? He's a child. He didn't have anything to do with it. He's African-American. I feel some resonance there with him. I can see that in that experience. So this is not where I have to work. But this is where I got to work here on this side of the screen with Ian Gibson. That's part of doing this internal assessment and really being able to situate yourself in truth where you are now. The last thing that I want to say, I'll leave that up there. Actually, I'm going to go back to this slide. The last thing that I want to say, the last story that I want to tell is something that just happened to me last week. And as you all know, I mean, the past 4 or 6 weeks when anti-racism and Black Lives Matter and questions about systemic racism, I'm telling you, I've been around for a while. I have never seen it this conversation had so publicly in my life. Now, I spend, about 30% of my time, I have a part-time residency at Middlebury College in the Franklin Environmental Center. So 2 days a week, well, back before the pandemic, I would spend my time there doing this work on the campus. But the rest of the week I was on a plane, you know, having these conversations around the country. I am working more now, and I'm not even going anywhere. It is out, it's retail businesses, environmental organizations, academic institutions, museums, community groups. Everybody is coming in a way that they haven't been before. Like, how can we have this conversation? What is it that we're going to do? Last Thursday, some of you might have seen in the Washington Post, there was an article that was entitled "Liberal, Progressive, and Racist: The Sierra Club Faces Its White Supremacist History." This article talked about organizations like the Sierra Club and the Union of Concerned Scientists. And they talked about the way that these organizations have essentially ignored the racism embedded and expressed in conservation historically, and some would say presently as well, and particularly through its icon, John Muir. So this was quite a long article. They talked about this. They had quotes from the head of Sierra Club and other people talking about what's going on and this conversation and what it means, right? And they were calling out that racism themselves and saying what they were going to do. But the other thing that really moved me was a letter from a Black woman. And they had her picture there. Her name was Ruth Tyson. There was a link that you could click on. She had worked for the Union of Concerned Scientists, and she had left after 3 years. And she wrote them a 17-page letter. And I'm just going to read the headings of that letter that she wrote, which got made public in the Washington Post. The headings that she had in that 17-page letter said, "Black Lives Matters. Black stories should be listened to. Black minds are valuable. Black culture should be respected. Black healing is necessary. Where are all the Black people? Black women deserve respect. Space is Black. Black joy is possible. Affirm Black life." She wrote this letter and then she walked away from a job she couldn't afford to walk away from. And for me, it was really important to witness her letter, not just to read it, to actually witness this, because I could have written that same letter a few years ago about a particular institution. But the fact that it can be made public right now is what really blew my mind. I had a visceral reaction to that in this moment. But I also felt something else. So I felt angry, I felt rage, I felt sadness, I felt a little bit of fear, I want to say, about, oh my God, it's out there like that. But I also felt something else. I felt, because a major publication was publishing these words, there was something about it. There was something about this moment that it was potent. We're having a public conversation. It's alive. We can't hide it. The curtain has been pulled back. The rug has been pulled back. Everything's been pulled back, and it's out there. Yes, many of us have been saying this stuff for years, but in truth, it's felt at best one-directional and at worst ignored. And then, yes, there are a few things I can criticize about this article. For example, why is Sierra Club only speaking out now? Does this mean that the ED of Sierra Club wants to look good or do good? I can ask all those questions about the article, but there's something about us having this conversation out loud. So the last thing that I want to say to you is that I got a call about the day after this article from a friend of mine who happens to be African-American, who said, "I need to connect you with Robert Hanna." Robert Hanna is the great-great-grandson of John Muir. And over a period of 2 days, we had a number of conversations, he and I, and then we did a podcast on Saturday, which you can see now when you have your time, it's out there, about who Muir was. And for me, I cannot tell you, this wasn't a perfect conversation, but I wrote that piece that Chris mentioned earlier because I want to create a one-woman show called The N-Word Nature Revisited about what it might be like to have a conversation with John Muir. Because I've said, yes, that John Muir was racist. John Muir was also passionate about non-human nature. He was committed to non-human nature. Someone who, like myself, who's had the privilege of spending 5 years going on a walkabout in different parts of the world, when he talks about doing that, I understand it. I feel like I understand the power of learning and knowing and being on the landscape. But here's the thing, he and I cannot do that in the same way. We can't do it in the same way. Those stories won't be lifted up in the same way, and they won't be engaged in the same way. I took one of his books, 1,000 Mile Walk Through the Gulf in 1867, where he spent a year walking through southern states in Cuba to get an understanding of the impact of war in the landscape. And I took quotes of his where he, you could see that he has a real keen power of observation and how he leaned in and how he wrote that down. And I read some of those things, how he felt comfortable in that space. But I also read how he, talked about African Americans in really demeaning ways at the same time. And I imagined, what if a Black woman was doing that walk? Right? I made up a name, Sojourner Washington Douglass. What if Sojourner Washington Douglass also tried to walk the landscape in 1867? And the thing is, when I started to put it together, what I understood was she was going to be ducking and weaving through a hostile landscape in a very different way. She was going to have to think about lynching and Jim Crow segregation, that the way that they both show up is entirely different. And the thing is, we don't like to talk about Sojourner Washington Douglass's experience any more than we like to talk about Christian Cooper's experience in relation to Amy Cooper in the park when he's supposed to be bird watching. For me, they are not that far apart. There's just a lot of time that has passed in between, but we have never actively dealt with the roots of that. And for me, it's not about erasing John Muir. I don't want to erase John Muir at all, actually. Right? That is not my intent. For me, again, it is not one or the other. It is understanding how they come together and are connected. I wrote here, when we think about Christian Cooper and Amy Cooper in the park, or my parents' experience on the land, it's not about John Muir or Sojourner Washington Douglass. It's not about Christian Cooper or Amy Cooper. It's not about my parents versus the owner's experience on the land. It's about all of these experiences together. And keep in mind something that we have to remember, that all this land was stolen, and that is always true. So that complicates it even more. It's always underneath here, that this is who we are, not a single narrative that tries to universalize our experience by erasing what we don't want to see. As conservation biologists, I know you know what it means to embrace that complexity. I know you know what it means to embrace that complexity. And here's the beauty of it. You don't need a special degree. You just have to be willing to take that risk to see differently and do differently. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Caroline, for your words and leading with love and compassion. I'm always grateful to share space with you. So I'm Sean Watts. I'm the owner of SM Watts Consulting, and I'll be moderating today's panel. I wanted to thank SCB for making this plenary happen, for Kim Terrell and Max Lambert and Becky Tonieto and Megan Cavill for all the back-end work. So we've pre-recorded and stitched together a series of short talks from each of the panelists. As a reminder, the audience can submit questions at any time, but they're going to be held until the discussion. Again, if you're on Twitter, please blow us up with the hashtag inclusive conservation. So to kick off the series of talks, Virtual Me will present on the philosophical gap between the conservation and environmental justice movements, and then we'll roll on through the rest of the panelists. And we'll come back in a little bit. Thanks.
So I've wanted to be a conservation biologist for longer than I knew the term for it. But I grew up poor, and it wasn't until long after college that I realized you didn't have to be absolutely miserable to work in the field. I remember thinking that the foot rot of running trap lines in the rain and jeans and $20 boots was just the price you had to pay for a career in conservation. There's this culture of self-sacrifice that is infused throughout the environmental and conservation sciences in so many ways, and I believe is not just exclusionary, but is hampering the progress that we need toward the very goals of biodiversity conservation. These are the white male and in the past racist giants of our field. Whether conservationist or preservationist, the core debate's centered on how to protect nature from people. And this underpins what I call this culture of self-sacrifice. $4,200 plus airfare to Madagascar. You know it's bad when they have entire websites dedicated to affording internships abroad. And these are the experiences that both inspire individuals and grant access to the mentors who will open doors for you. Killing poachers? And what is driving the poaching? And the choices are between polar bears or dolphins. So where does my kid fall in that kind of calculus? The myth, organic food is too expensive. Fact, the benefits outweigh the costs for many. Organic food may be expensive, but it's worth it is not an equitable pitch. It forces people to ask, do I belong here? And that is no way to build a movement. So contrast this with the history and core motivations of the environmental justice movement. In 1982, the government of North Carolina was planning to dump 6,000 truckloads of toxic soil in Afton, North Carolina. 523 arrests, 6 weeks of protests, and North Carolina dumped it anyway. But it formally sparked the environmental justice movement and forced the Government Accountability Office's hand. And in 1983, they found that 3 out of 4 toxic landfills were sited in low-income communities of color. And the power of their message is in its moral imperative. How are you going to beat down on somebody who just had 6,000 truckloads of toxic soil dumped in their neighborhood? So this is what I refer to as the original sin of the conservation and environmental movements. Traditional conservation frames their mission as protecting nature from people. Environmental justice frames their mission as protecting people from human-degraded nature. And this contrast set these two movements on different trajectories. And in 1990, the Southwest Organizing Project sent an open letter accusing the big NGOs of exclusionary policies and complacency with regard to environmental racism. 30 years later, there's simply not enough to show in diversifying conservation, which is ironic given that conservation embraces the benefit and the necessity of diversity. While conservation is focused on saving nature and defining wild as something pristine and remote, fragile, people of color have been suffering and dying in the places white people the world over and for centuries have pushed their environmental damage. So we're calling on conservationists to flip the current playbook from educating people on the benefits of nature and fitting community needs into conservation to training scientists and practitioners about the benefits to nature of addressing the needs of people. We must empower people of color and acknowledge their needs and values. Communities of color know best what they need most. And poll after poll shows that people of color rank the environment and wildlife as a higher priority than white folks in this nation. Scientists, policymakers, and practitioners must listen to learn and develop new muscles because we need you. I'm still a conservationist to the core, and that is why I'm begging conservation to get its shit together. If we get DEI right, the payoff is a vastly more durable, effective, and broadly endorsed platform from which to deliver our science. On the other hand, many organizations are being dragged kicking and screaming to address their shocking lack of diversity, resentful of this equity fad, which is a quote I've heard several times in my work, that gets in the way of rigorous science. These diverse and name-only organizations that are just learning the language of equity to satisfy grant requirements, for example, are going to go extinct. And this time, the asteroid is demographic inevitability, and it'll be too late to catch up later. And so we have an excellent panel of distinguished conservation biologists who will walk you through many examples of how to recast conservation. But I'll leave you with one question to ask yourselves if you work with lower-income communities or communities of color. Will they be better off when you leave or if you never came? Will the residents have more power, jobs, skills, influence? Will they be more cohesive? If you can't say yes, then you are perpetuating the extractive and transactional white supremacy culture that created the inequities in the first place. And you're hampering our ability to craft solutions that will actually achieve large-scale biodiversity conservation. Because people will never choose an endangered species over their hungry child, nor should you ask them to. Thank you.
And now our next speaker, Madhusudan Katti, will dive deeper into the history that calls on us to decolonize conservation.
Namaskar. My name is Madhusudan Katti, and I speak to you from the traditional territories of the Tutelo and Saponi people in what we now call North Carolina. I'm an associate professor of public science at North Carolina State University and an immigrant to this land from India. How wonderful it is to see this 2020 Congress begin with a land acknowledgement. It only took a few decades since the academic discipline of conservation biology was defined and the society was born for us to finally acknowledge that the lands we inhabit here in North America once belonged to various indigenous people whose descendants continue to live marginal lives torn from their ancestral homes and cultural practices. One of the penalties of an ecological education is that one lives alone in a world of wounds. Although Leopold famously said that in a text much revered by conservation biologists, especially here in North America. It is this curse of living in a world of ever-deepening ecological wounds and a yearning for lost wilderness that lie at the heart of this discipline. Yet there are other wounds we have long failed to notice as we seek to repair ecological injuries to restore nature to a state we imagine as wilderness, which is, in my favorite definition, a place where the hand of man has not set foot. But it is a fantasy that many of the lands in the most famous protected areas were ever devoid of people. A dangerous fantasy that to protect biodiversity, we must now remove people from half the earth. The land acknowledgement today is a necessary first step towards opening our eyes fully and seeing the world as it is, full of not just the ecological wounds we are trained to see, but equally deep wounds to the people inhabiting the ecosystems we seek to protect. People whom we too often help eject from their homes to chase this fantasy of wilderness. But this is only the first step. We must also unravel the historical roots of how the habitats we seek to protect come to bear the wounds we see. These wounds were inflicted by the same colonial and racist forces that conquered and destroyed indigenous lives and cultures around the world, and continue to do so now in the 21st century. We must learn to see how the colonialist and capitalist exploitation of natural resources for the economic benefit of the few comes at the expense of both nature and many people. We must stop pitting man versus nature into a simplistic binary that is averse to examining how political and economic power is wielded within human societies to perpetuate generations of inequality and injustice. We must learn how to see how the wounds we see in nature are intertwined with the wounds inflicted upon people who are most desperately need that nature and who have traditionally been its best protectors. It took until last week for the Sierra Club to acknowledge that its founder, John Muir, was a racist colonialist who, in protecting Yosemite, erased its native inhabitants from their landscape. It took a century for his descendants in Western science to catch up to indigenous knowledge of how fire was an important tool they used to keep that landscape in what he thought was its pristine state. Likewise, we must acknowledge that many of the revered academic elders of conservation biology, from Muir and Leopold to Soule and Wilson, held views that were complicit in the exploitation of indigenous peoples, in the demonization of immigrants and refugees, in the repression of black and brown peoples, and in their continued exclusion from the wilderness we cherish. Even in the former colony of India, I was trained to view the world through the Western colonial ecological lens and see only the wounded ecosystems while filtering out the wounded people in those ecosystems. It is past time that we remove these filters and see the world we have helped create, where conservation biology is too often aligned with colonial and racist systems of power that exploit people, where we are trained to trade off the well-being of the poorest people to save endangered species, while the rich and powerful continue to profit and consolidate power. It is time for conservation biology to start its own process of truth and reconciliation, like post-apartheid South Africa, to recognize the harm our discipline has done to the most vulnerable people and begin to repair ecological wounds in ways that reconcile social and racial justice with biodiversity conservation. Humans and nature are not separate categories, but integral parts of the whole earth we must preserve for future generations. Thank you, and I now yield to Suzanne Greenlaw, who will share indigenous perspectives on Euro-American and Western conservation.
Thank you for the introduction and the opportunity to speak here today. My name is Suzanne Greenlaw. I am a citizen of the Halton-Bana-Maliseet Indians. I'm also a PhD candidate at the University of Maine in the School of Forest Resources. My research works to mobilize Indigenous knowledge to address our cultural resource issues. Indigenous knowledge is the knowledge held by Indigenous people, generated over thousands of years. It's cumulative, contains a variety of knowledge sources, and requires the active engagement of Indigenous people. Indigenous knowledge is iterative and encompasses the action, process, and formation of knowledge. So our knowledge is both a process and a product. It's not just a collection of stories, ceremonies, and objects that can be used as a source of data. Right, so our knowledge is a complete knowledge system with its own concept of epistemology, philosophy, scientific and logical validity. Indigenous knowledge has ensured that Native people have survived and thrived for thousands of years. Interest in Indigenous knowledge is growing among non-Native scientists and government agencies as a new source of information that can complement Western science knowledge systems. The knowledge Indigenous people hold can offer insights and tools that can be applied to environmental conservation, restoration, ecosystem management, and climate change adaptation. So scientists familiar with these benefits have conducted integration or co-production studies that integrate Indigenous knowledge systems within Western scientific research and models. Integrating Indigenous knowledge within the Western science approach has ranged from Indigenous knowledge being supplemental data, which tends to be very extractive, to a full collaborative research project or process, where Native people are co-PIs. While collaborative approaches are increasing, McAuliffe in a 2019 study found on a global scale, 87% of the climate change studies are practicing an extractive model with Indigenous people. In these studies, Indigenous people had minimal participation or decision-making authority. Indigenous studies that are extractive have potentially many negative outcomes and can cause harm to Native people. From co-opting the Indigenous knowledge by non-Native people, misuse or misrepresentation of this knowledge, and the diminution of Indigenous knowledge to fit into the parameters and interests of academic investigators and funding agencies. Integration studies can reinforce Western cultural biases that in the end work against Native people managing their own cultural resources. Academic research has power over Indigenous people's practice because it informs policy. So scientists with very little understanding of Indigenous people or Indigenous knowledge are in a powerful position to define Indigenous knowledge for the larger society, determine which factors of Indigenous knowledge are most important, and then validate Indigenous knowledge within the scientific world. Linda Tuhiwai Smith in Decolonizing Methodologies state that Indigenous people are the most researched people in the world, yet their lives have not improved. So instead of conducting integration research, where Western science sets the standards of how Indigenous people will be understood, we as scientists should shift research focus to action in enhancing Indigenous sovereignty that are bound to these stewardship practices that we value. Thank you. And next you'll be hearing from Megan, who will be speaking on community engagement.
Hi everyone, my name is Megan Haza. I am the founding director of the Porch Project, and I'm also a community engagement consultant for research programs that happen in Flint, Michigan and elsewhere. I want to start out by asking you what community engagement means to you. It could be the action plan that you have in place for how you put out your research into a community. It could be whether you use flyers or different ways to engage. I really want you to take a moment to think about what that means. For me, as a person who deals with engagement often, when I think of that term, I think of an overused term. A term that now has been used to kind of write off how hard we work to engage a community. I often think that engagement is misplaced with outreach. Outreach is more the action of finding a way into the community, where engagement is the kickback you get for doing it right. And oftentimes when you as a a university or an institution, when they go out into the community, they're really only doing outreach and they stop there. The reason I got into this, I live in Flint, Michigan, and I lived during the water crisis. And the approach that researchers took was to come and knock on doors from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. Sometimes they'd wake up my son from nap time or interrupt my dinner. So me, like a lot of other residents, started to close our shades and lock our front doors and not answer the door when somebody knocked. And that was an example of ineffective outreach and ineffective engagement. So when I started the Porch Project, the way that I did that, I lived on the east side of Flint. I had just bought my home, and I decided to go outside and redo my porch. I needed just some revamping. So I dug up my flower bed, I trimmed my tree, I power washed my porch, painted it a nice white color, and through that 6-week process, I met all my neighbors. And I kind of got this idea that if I could use this to engage my neighbors, it could work for everyone across the city. And I kind of got involved with engagement through that. I think that oftentimes institutions and universities have this one-size-fits-all approach to engagement. And just like we look at human beings, every human being is different. I have a different talent than the person next to me. Communities are the same. And with the one-size-fits-all approach to engagement, researchers are failing. Institutions are failing to properly engage the community, to properly find what works for that community, what benefits that community the most. It's kind of this top-down approach to it right now, where the university thinks of what they need, they take it down to the community, and they hope that it works. What we do is we use this bottom-up approach where we find a need of the community and then we bring it up to a university and we find somebody who has aligning goals and intersecting needs. And what I mean by that is somebody who wants to benefit the community in the same way. That would be the goal that they have and the need. So one of my research partners who needed flowers for their research, where we just needed flowers for a flower bed. That was kind of like we had intersecting needs, where we kind of just had this natural relationship where there was this immediate impact on the community. The community then, when we left, was already initially and first off benefited from what was happening around them. And then I want to take this even deeper. So as a researcher who goes into a community and publishes papers, how often does that community have the accessibility to read that paper? How often do researchers come out and say, oh, we want to change the planet, we want to change the way that humans interact with the outside world around them, and those humans who are supposed to change the way the planet works, or who are supposed to impact and change habits and change the way that they live to create a better planet for everyone in the long run, how are they supposed to access your research and understand it and know it and take what you've learned on the backs of these communities and actually put it into practice? How often do we take our language and our education that we work so hard for and just leave it at that? Engagement is about creating accessibility, creating pathways, about using your education and your experiences to advocate and amplify voices of communities who are hurting, who are dealing with social justice issues, who are dealing with different environmental issues. And researchers come in and they claim that they're changing that, but they don't actually ever create an accessible route for the people in those communities to change them themselves. The language barriers between research and common language is crazy to me. Last I want to end this with is equitable change. Because of our experiences or because of our educations, we have the opportunity to really have a role in changing the way that communities are looked at, changing the way that humans interact with their planet, and we are failing simply because we are not engaging. We are not going to a community and saying, hey, I'm going to make this community look better afterwards. I'm going to make sure that my approach works for this specific community, even though it may not be the same in the next one. I'm going to make sure that I am touching this community in a way that's beneficial to them. Equitable change is done through connecting research, connecting humans, connecting the land all in one, and making sure that we are able to move forward and change the world together. We need to make sure that when we talk about engagement, we're actually doing engagement. We're not just doing outreach. We need to make sure that when we talk about producing these papers and changing the world, that we're creating a pathway for people to read it and understand it. And then we need to make sure that our education is actually being used to advocate and amplify the pain and the hurt and the suffering that communities have felt for years.
Hi folks, my name is Talia Young. I'm the director of a program called Fishadelphia and also a visiting assistant professor in environmental studies at Haverford College. I'm super delighted and honored to be here today. I'm going to talk a little bit about some work that I'm doing that's based in the idea that conservation and social equity are inextricably intertwined. My degree is in ecology and evolution, fish science, I call it. I was the kind of kid who joined the environmental club in middle school. But at some point, I began wondering why we were doing all this work to save the rainforests we'd never been to, and why we were spending time on frogs and whales when there were obvious and more pressing social problems closer to home. I got interested in fish because fish is a place where it makes sense to talk about the environment and people at the same time. As Ray Troll says, no fish, no fishermen. And I really like fish, but I'm really fundamentally interested in people and equity. And it turns out, if you work with fish and you're interested in people, one place to go with that is to work with fishermen. So I began to get involved with work in fishing communities and came to understand some of the challenges there, like the struggle to find viable domestic markets for sustainably caught fish. But it became clear to me that working in fishing communities, at least in the Northeast US where I come from and live, involves working in large part with rural, white, working-class men, which is incredibly crucial work, and I really hope some of you are doing that. But it's not a great fit for me. I'm the queer child of Chinese immigrant scientist parents, so I began to wonder how I could best contribute here. I was at a local fisheries conference where a fisherman declared, "Americans only know how to eat cod and salmon fillets. We need to teach them how to eat other kinds of fish." I had a gut response to this. You're just not talking to the right Americans. I grew up in New York City and have lived in Philadelphia for nearly 20 years. I shop at Whole Foods, but I also shop at Asian supermarkets, and let me tell you, the seafood counters look pretty different in those places. I don't cook a ton of seafood at home, but when I eat seafood in Chinese restaurants, it's not cod or salmon fillets. It's whole fish, crabs, lobster, clams, jellyfish, sea cucumber, abalone. And it's not just us. My Black American friends eat a ton of seafood. Salmon and cod for sure, but also crabs and clams and squid and whole fish. The people in my life who eat the most seafood and know the most about it are all people of color. So sure, I know plenty of people who eat only cod and salmon fillets, but it's definitely not all Americans. So I started Fishadelphia as part of a postdoc project to see if it might be possible to build a program to connect mixed-income, culturally diverse seafood consumers in Philadelphia with sustainable seafood harvesters on the Jersey Shore, and whether this program could be a model for expanding the way we think about solutions for U.S. fish harvesters, sustainable fisheries, and equitable access to high-quality food. It was never my dream to start a seafood business, but before I went to grad school, I taught high school science, and I think it's pretty fun and interesting to work with young people on real-world projects. So, Fishadelphia is based at 2 high schools in Philadelphia, and we work with the students after school to coordinate the day-to-day operations of the program. We buy high-quality, sustainably harvested fresh fish and shellfish from docks, harvesters, and shellfish farmers on the New Jersey Shore and bring it into the city every other week. Many of our customers subscribe to ongoing deliveries, while others order week by week. Customers used to pick up at the schools, but since the advent of COVID, we send coolers around the city and customers pick up from their neighbors' porches. We have a 2-tiered price system. Regular rate is $20 a week for a pound of fillets, and community rate is $10 a week. Customers qualify for community rate if they're eligible for food stamps, send a student to one of our schools, and are referred by another community rate customer. Is it working? It depends what you mean by working. Are we getting locally, sustainably harvested seafood out to people? Yes. Are we serving mixed income families and communities of color? To some extent, yes. Are we connecting seafood eaters with seafood harvesters? Yes. We run a dock trip every year where we take customers to see where their seafood come from. Are we supporting local seafood harvesters? Yes, but the quantities we're currently buying are a drop in the bucket. But we are building a model that can be scaled up and used elsewhere. I would love to talk more in the Q&A, afterwards, or individually. Give me a shout.
Hi all, my name is Max Lambert, and I'm a David H. Smith postdoctoral fellow and urban conservation biologist based out of UC Berkeley and the University of Washington. I want to spend a few minutes setting up some content for the next 2 speakers, Deja Perkins and Chris Schell, to expand upon. In particular, I'll talk about the ecological and conservation consequences of social inequality, particularly with respect to race. Social inequality is the unequal access to wealth and resources across different human communities as a result of various social norms and policies. Now, by limiting who has access to wealth and resources, social inequality fundamentally reshapes and restructures ecosystems and landscapes. And nowhere really is this felt on Earth as strongly as it is in cities and other urban environments. In the United States, perhaps one of the best studied and most apparent consequences of social inequality on landscapes is the racist practice of redlining. Now, redlining came about in the early to mid 20th century when the federal government created the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which was tasked with helping banks figure out which were the least and most risky neighborhoods for providing loans to for purchasing homes and for starting businesses. So what the Homeowners Loan Corporation did was map out cities across the country, outlining neighborhoods in green if they were deemed the least risky, and those that were the most risky in red, therefore redlining. However, one of the most consequential factors that the Homeowners Loan Corporation used to deem a neighborhood as risky was the presence of Black people. What this fundamentally did was restrict access to loans for purchasing homes and starting businesses to Black communities, which functionally limited access to wealth and resources and services. And this legacy persists today, despite the fact that the policy is, of course, no longer in place. It's not only limited wealth immediately, but also really impeded generational wealth. So the ability to accrue wealth over time by your kids and grandkids. And of course, the absence of wealth and resources in these communities really transformed how these environments grew and developed over time with respect to green line neighborhoods. And that actually has pretty substantial conservation implications. So let's take a look at some of those. This is a redlining map of Minneapolis, Minnesota. You can see the red and green line neighborhoods stand out from each other, as well as green and blue neighborhoods, which are intermediately risky according to the Homeowners Loan Corporation. And underlying this map is a NDVI map, which is a representation of tree cover and vegetation in the city. And it's pretty apparent here, the green line neighborhoods have much more expansive green throughout the neighborhoods, as well as deeper, richer green. Something that's completely absent really from the red line neighborhoods. So the red line neighborhoods have very few trees, very few green spaces relative to green line neighborhoods. And importantly, green line neighborhoods are not only green now, but they became increasingly green over time, something that was not seen in red line neighborhoods across cities in the United States. And this pattern is pervasive across different sorts of variables. Red line neighborhoods are the epicenter of the urban heat island effect, so they are much warmer than green line areas. In part because they have fewer trees and much more impervious surface cover. They are also where pollution is concentrated. Air, water, and soil pollution are much higher in red line areas than they are in green line areas, and so on. What it fundamentally means is that red line areas, Black communities, are fundamentally distinct parts of the urban ecosystem compared to formerly green line neighborhoods. Now, conservation biologists oftentimes try and study their systems by thinking about how some aspect of the ecosystem or their species differs with respect to how much impervious surface cover, like roads or concrete, is nearby, where the presence and concentration of certain pollutants are. But what they fundamentally rarely do is understand these systemic biases, and particularly structural racism, that underlies how these urban variables are structured across the landscape. And without really an eye to racism, we can't really understand and do anything about urban conservation moving forward. So what does that mean for moving forward? It means that within the cycle of social and environmental justice, urban conservation can play an important part, but it cannot be the singular and main goal of conservation just to do conservation. Social justice must be at the forefront of our values and missions if we are to be successful in conserving and restoring ecosystems and species globally. What that fundamentally means is rethinking how we approach who stewards landscapes and who is involved in doing the research and doing conservation practice, not only in urban systems, but in systems across the world. This requires a really strong practice of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and putting social justice at the forefront of conservation's mission. With that, I will hand it off to Deja Perkins and Chris Hell to expand it from here.
Hello, everyone. My name is Deja Perkins, and today I want to discuss with you how spatial and racial distribution resulting from redlining shows up in our citizen science data sets and how redlining creates a spatial matrix that still exists today. For the past 2 years, I have been working with a citizen science project called the Triangle Bird Count, where we have been mapping the distribution and diversity of birds across the Triangle region and across a variety of different socioeconomic neighborhoods. Now, one aspect of my master's project was to map eBird observations across Raleigh, North Carolina, and Tucson, Arizona. In Raleigh, we see a lot of these blue observation points being done in these darker purple areas, these areas that equate to higher income. Many of these observations are being recorded in areas between $62,000 and $200,000 in income. Now in Tucson, we see a similar pattern where again, we're seeing a lot of these blue observation points being concentrated in these darker purple areas or these areas with higher income. And in Tucson, that means in areas between $45,000 and $200,000 in income. Now we also see in Tucson that a lot of these larger blue circles or areas that observation points that have higher richness are also being concentrated in these darker purple areas. And so in Tucson, that means that we have higher richness in areas between $79,000 and $200,000 in income. Now, if you're looking at this map, you can see that this is a problem because we're not capturing the entire spatial distribution of the study site or the landscape, and that we have gaps in our data and we're missing a lot of key important points. And this is problematic because it will reflect in how we apply management and policy, essentially erasing entire neighborhoods and only making management decisions off of data from high income areas. Now, there are several reasons for this. One being that participation in citizen science is racially biased, and that reflects in our data sets. Barriers to citizen science can include lack of access to natural spaces, lack of transportation, lack of knowledge about scientific programs, and even conflicts between day-to-day responsibilities and these scientific extracurricular activities. Another reason for this is because of volunteer bias. Now, eBird was meant to match the way that bird watchers go birding. And so a lot of times what we see is people repeatedly visiting the same sites over and over again, and oftentimes they'll be visiting these areas with higher diversity because that's what they want to capture. But these areas with higher diversity are typically areas in higher income neighborhoods because of the quality of the park and essentially the quality of the habitat. But why? This is because of the historical and racial practices that were set up in these neighborhoods and set up the structures of our cities and ultimately of our country. As a result, parks in the historically Black neighborhoods are often of lower quality and less invested in monetarily with less diversity and environmental amenities, compared to parks in majority neighborhoods, which are heavily invested in, which are reflected in the quality and the amount of environmental amenities provided. This monetary investment that goes into parks at the end of the day doubles for wildlife habitat. And let's be real, it's not just about the monetary investment in parks, it's about the monetary investment in neighborhoods, because birds and other wildlife don't exclusively live in parks. If we're talking about how to better manage for wildlife and conserve wildlife in cities, we need to think about the underlying racial practices and systematic structures that have caused these patterns that we're seeing today. It's important that we capture these differences in our data to be able to better manage, but at the end of the day, also for the people who are at the center of all of this, and to be able to allow them to experience the nature in their own neighborhoods. We cannot exclusively think about and talk about conservation science without applying a racial justice and social justice lens. Minority neighborhoods were historically placed in areas with higher environmental hazards, pollution, and lower quality land. Conservation, environmental justice, and climate justice and social justice are all intertwined. You can't talk about one or study one without the other unless you miss the whole picture. So how do we change to make sure that our data is more equitable and accurately reflecting the landscape? It starts with how we collect data in our practices. One solution is using a more systematic approach. Systematic counts are designed to capture the spatial distribution of the study site equally. It utilizes a grid with emphasis on placing one observation point per cell, eliminating some of that volunteer bias as well by assigning people where to go and sample. And my master's project has shown that this works. Using a more systematic approach, we can get a more representative sample of the urban landscape and be able to better detect those important underlying socioeconomic structures that otherwise would be missed when we're making decisions about the future of the landscape. If we aren't prioritizing and capturing racial and social justice in our methodology, we are collecting bad data and inherently doing bad science. We can't think about conservation without looking at those underlying racial and historical structures. Otherwise, we miss the entire picture. And now I'll pass the mic off to Dr. Chris Schell.
My name is Chris Schell, and I'm an assistant professor of urban ecology at the University of Washington, Tacoma. To wrap up our series of short plenary talks, I want to illustrate how we as conservation scientists and practitioners can and should be stewards of civil rights in our fight for substantive conservation, sustainability, and restoration ecology issues. As many of my fellow colleagues have stated, the drivers of biodiversity loss and climate change are themselves driven and exacerbated by social and racial inequality. Our reluctance or purposeful avoidance of societal issues therefore jeopardizes our ability to successfully develop and implement any conservation action. The historical and contemporary roots of the 1960s civil rights movement and the Black Lives Matter movement challenged the US and the globe to live up to the ideals of life, liberty, and justice, which to this day are not afforded to marginalized communities. The original environmental justice principles born out of the civil rights movement clearly emphasized that access to a safe and healthy environment is a fundamental right. As conservation biologists, ecologists, practitioners, and planners, our fight for the planet must therefore be a fight for marginalized communities. The blueprint for how we embody conservation activism has driven and been driven by civil rights leaders that show us the way. Transcribing their wisdom reveals the path forward. Conservation actions must emphatically be rooted in both societal and natural equity, aka Angela Davis. As such, actions will invariably determine the future of our planet, aka James Baldwin. And we cannot rest on our laurels whenever we gain a modicum of success, because conservation action requires diligence and resolve over time, aka John Lewis. Indeed, they have laid our foundation, and it is our responsibility to carry it forward. Actionable items and what we consider a conservation action will necessarily need to be challenged, especially in urban environments. Societal policies that we often think of as increasing social equity all have downstream consequences on how global societies function. We must therefore adopt a transdisciplinary mindset to advance our science and our communities. To conclude, think of anti-racist activism and conservation in terms of this metaphor. In the Pacific Northwest, Himalayan blackberry on the left and English ivy on the right are non-native plants that are highly prolific at outcompeting native vegetation. During the COVID-19 pandemic, I have taken to gardening and quickly learned that I needed to actively remove these two species every day. However, my neighbor generally refuses to acknowledge the plants as an issue, often stating, "I don't see them," or "they aren't that big of a deal," and proceeds to let those plants grow in his yard. Eventually, overgrowth extending over and under his fence into our yard has made non-native plant removal more difficult. Hence, my efforts as an individual were compromised by my neighbor's unwillingness to acknowledge the problem and work towards a solution. This urban conservation metaphor is not unlike anti-racist activism. We all must be diligent in stamping out systemic racism and white supremacy wherever we see it. And refusing to do so on a community-wide level severely compromises our ability for substantive change. Moreover, the work becomes increasingly harder as the roots of systemic racism, like the blackberry and ivy, get larger, stronger, and harder to eradicate. Hence, as Angela Davis exclaimed, it is not enough to be non-racist. We must all be anti-racist and use conservation as a tool for justice. This change starts with us. We must be ready and willing to confront white supremacy and systemic racism wherever it may be. And we need to do so consistently, even when it's not ideal. Our world and planet depends on us reconciling the sins of our past and present. And that means having tough conversations about race, equity, and justice. Then and only then can we work to save the world.
Okay, thank you all. And if all the panelists can turn on their video and unmute, unless you've got screaming kids, or even if you do, who cares? So thank you. I don't know about all the rest of the folks on the panel, but it is so restorative to just be in this space, to hear all of this coming from all these different mouths, and to just have all of this surfaced. But I also wanted to acknowledge that, you know, terms like white supremacist culture, historically white-led, can make some white folks bristle and feel attacked. And, you know, all of this is understandable. But I urge white folks just in general in the audience to understand this term as an empirical truth. It's not an insult or intended as such, or slander. It's important for us to understand the entirety of Western and colonial culture and all of its institutions throughout history were built on a foundation of white supremacy, and it's just never been reconciled fully. And I think particularly relevant to the Society of Conservation Biology, you know, scientific culture itself is particularly prone to some of the characteristics of white supremacy culture: perfectionism, worship of the written word, reductionist or binary thinking, power hoarding. And this kind of dysfunction just works through academia and affects everyone, regardless of your ethnicity. And just, I don't know if we can post it anywhere, but if you haven't read the classic Jones and Okun paper from 2001 on, you know, that has a whole useful list of characteristics of white supremacy culture, and importantly, their antidotes, it'd be great to look that up. So it's Kenneth Jones and Tima Okun, and it's white supremacy culture. So just to kick us off, and maybe to help folks understand just how ever present white supremacy culture is, it's, you know, it's this water that we swim through. So if the panelists might be able to share some quick anecdotes that show white supremacy culture in action in academia or in the practice of conservation, and in particular, if you can kind of relate that to how you've seen it limit our conservation goals, that I think would be instructive and helpful. So just maybe you can raise your hands too for me to track who wants to speak. But anybody can start. Go ahead, Madhu.
All right, I'll jump in here. And I wanted to say that it's not just white supremacy. As a conservationist who grew up in India, there's also a Brahminical patriarchy that's dominant in India as well. So there are multiple levels of this kind of colonial mindsets that operate in different parts of the world. So white supremacy is part of it, and we have, of course, colorism that goes along with our caste privileges. But in terms of specifically of white supremacy, one example I can give is a personal one. From when I was a graduate student doing field research in India as a grad student in the US, and I had a white PhD supervisor who admonished me for sometimes taking time away from my research to network with local communities and work on some sort of nature education, conservation kind of activities. And the thing that sort of burned in my memory is, the way he more than once told me that my Indian cultural baggage was holding me back from being a good scientist.
Wow.
So that's my anecdote.
And how did that limit conservation goals?
Well, it limited my personal ability to engage with some of the things that I wanted to do in that national park where we were working.
Yeah.
I got so many of those stories. Oh my! I'm sitting here going, which one? The idea, I like that. You brought up it was your experience to think that within academia that it is, and I want to say it's hard for me to. I have no problem talking about these things, but I also recognize that there's a way that somebody can dismiss them as, well, that's just your problem. You just couldn't step up, right? So I just want to throw that out there and say that. When I started as an assistant professor at UC Berkeley in 2007, 2008, and one of the faculty who was a white woman who would describe herself, I think, as liberal and progressive. Just how, you know, aside from teaching the largest class, the lowest paid in a department of 75, the only African-American in a department of 75, besides all those details, it was things like, I didn't make enough money. You know, Berkeley was an expensive place. You know, I needed to make more money. And it was one of the reasons I started thinking about I could consult around this work, you know, and it would also be part of the research. The way research is defined, I was seeing it way more expansive. And, you know, I think about one of the panelists talking about community engagement and different ways to build those relationships. But I also needed to pay my rent, you know, and my school loans. And I remember, you know, getting emails that all they would say is, "Stop traveling!" exclamation point. They wouldn't even have my name, wouldn't be like, "How are you?" When I would have to explain, you know, and kind of embarrassed about it, to explain what I was doing, that I was still working, but I needed to do this too. I would be met with silence. You know, moments all through the process about, you know, how I was expected to do something. Stop writing your book. One of the people who reviewed it, and I happen to know who it is, so I'm not going to say that. So I happen to know that they're white because I know who it is. It told me to stop writing it like a narrative. So thinking about, like, stop writing, like, we don't think that everything we write is a narrative. Like, wow, like there was so many things, like the assumption that if I try to bring something else into it, oh, stop using the I. Like, why are you talking about yourself at all? Like, and there's so many instances of this. And I know that some people are leaning into change, but I think a lot of people aren't. And there's a protection that gets set in place about who can actually be part of that conversation and how one can get recruited in. But the expectation is you will assimilate. You will not bring difference. You will assimilate. We are the Borg, you know. And how does that serve conservation? It doesn't. What it does is keep it exactly the way it is. And the thing that I empathize with is other people worrying about losing their own relevance. And I believe we have the capacity for everyone to be relevant. That's the thing. We have the capacity and we have the privilege. So we just have to be willing to step up and do it.
Thank you. Anybody else have a quick anecdote? Sure, Talia.
I thought about starting my talk by saying that I keep trying to leave conservation science and somehow I keep getting dragged back in.
Keep dragging
back in. Maybe we should all raise our hands if that is an experience that we've had. One way that I tell the story, and Dr. Finney talking about bringing our whole selves resonated a lot with me. I have two Facebook accounts. One is sort of for my own life and one is for my professional life. And the summer that Trayvon Martin was killed, I was in grad school and my two Facebook feeds were completely different. And no one, zero people on my work Facebook feed were talking about it. And I was like, I can't be here. I can't be with you. These are not the people I can spend the rest of my professional life working with. I am going to leave you all. Yeah. And so then I tried to do that. I was like, I'm going to sell fish. I'm going to do community development. I'm going to do other stuff. And for me, it's all wrapped up in the same goals. But this is sort of the first time that my whole self has been in the work. And then conservation biology keeps saying, oh no, this is conservation too. And I'm like, okay, great. I'm glad you feel that way, but I'm going to do the work that feels like I can do it and be my integral self. So, right, this is a different kind of story than the other stories that are telling, but that it feels a lot about like, how can I do the work that feels like that I have to do in the world? And it may or may not fit in conservation biology, but this is the work I have to do.
Yeah. And, you know, I when I work with, I consult with historically white-led organizations as kind of half of my work. Otherwise, it's community empowerment, kind of coalition building, policy liaison work. But one of the biggest things I have to do is we have to figure out how to blur appropriately the professional and the personal, because when you look at community-based organizations, everyone working there is working there because they believe passionately about public safety or street safety or getting their kids what they need. And that separation is part of the, I think, is part of that white supremacy culture that we see. Suzanne, did you want to add something? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, I just wanted to add a story, an anecdote I had about like white supremacy in science. Recently, I was approached by a geospatial scientist to help advise her study, and she was trying to map indigenous culture materials. It was not necessarily her focus, but it was a side onto her research, and she was more or less asking me if there is a existing database that she can feed into her habitat model. And she didn't hear anything we were saying, my coworker and I, about the structural inequalities in science that exist, and why that data doesn't exist, why there shouldn't be that data either. Like, she had no knowledge of what indigenous knowledge is, but yet she was going to work with it no matter what. And because she had the funding and she had the mandate to do it, and it was a small amount of funding, so her engagement for tribes was me, like a ways away from where she was. My child's here. And it didn't happen that way, but it did. And it didn't matter what I said. It was just that if I couldn't give her what she was asking, then she was done.
Yeah. And also and the expectation that you would just, share that without compensation, without any discussion. And a real quick anecdote there on the white supremacy culture is when I worked at a government funding agency, one of our grantees was working in the tropics, discovered a new, remarkable insect species. And they wrote the paper, they're systematists, they wrote the paper, published it, put the people, the local scientists who had actually made this discovery, on whose backs they had found this new insect, they put them in the acknowledgements, and that's it. Not just that, they named it, the common name they gave it was something that was incredibly insulting, and had they actually consulted with their local partners, they would have been like, no, it would have been like, naming a slug after Jesus. The equivalent thereof. So it was shocking. And we instituted some language, but it was, again, me forcing to push that language of like what true co-authorship, partnership in communities looks like, had to run up and down all of the floors in this agency, and it got watered down and watered down and watered down. And this is the invisible, perpetuation of this extractive, transactional culture that we just need to cure. So if there,
you just remind me of.
Oh, sorry. Go on.
Sorry. No, just saying, you just remind me quickly of another similar example where I think about a decade or so ago, scientists from the Wildlife Conservation Society had published an article about finding tigers living above the snow line in Bhutan. This is the first time tigers had been observed, was the narrative, and there was much publicity around it. But the fact is, how did they find these tigers living up above the tree line? Because the local villagers there told them that there are tigers up here. And that was hidden somewhere in the story, if you dig into the details.
Yeah, but they discovered it.
They discovered it.
Well, we have an audience question here. As multiple speakers have suggested, DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, cannot simply be focused on bringing diverse people to carry out the practice of conservation as it has, that is following Eurocentric notions of people and nature. The prospect of DEI means that we as a society will be confronted with epistemic and ontological plurality. How would the panel recommend we, as the Society for Conservation Biology, carry out a program to explore conservation goals that must navigate diverse and sometimes conflicting worldviews and priorities? So I'll say that last part again. How would the panel recommend that we as SCB carry out a program to explore conservation goals that must navigate diverse and sometimes conflicting worldviews and priorities? So reconciling the various cultural influences on the kind of current ontological purity, which is my Freudian slip there, and epistemic purity.
Carefully.
Yeah.
I'll start us off. I mean, the easiest short answer, right, is leadership. I think changing leadership and who, because I just recently watched Hamilton, right? So we need the people in the room where it happens that are part of these communities that are actually being impacted by many of the environmental ills that are being burdened on them. I think that's the very first thing, right? After that, certainly a lot of cascading influences about where we are in terms of what communities we work with. As you've heard from many of our speakers, doing legitimately community engagement, not just outreach, and being about it, right? So appreciate that, Megan. Being about it, actually being in the community and talking to people and hearing back from them, using traditional ecological knowledge like Suzanne talked about, and talking to many of these community members. I talk to my neighbors all the time that know about how to grow different things, when things grow, what animals come through the neighborhood. Legitimately having those conversations and also acknowledging them, not just in the acknowledgement section where it's a foothold, right? So like Madhu was talking about, but making them co-authors, actually put some currency to the names of the people that are in these conversations and pay them for their work. Don't just have them be volunteers, actually give them funding because they're providing you a service. Give them money, give them the money that they deserve. Restitution, reparations, whatever you want to call it, pay them. I could go on and on, but I bet the rest of the panelists have stuff to say.
Can I build on some of the stuff you're saying, Chris? Because I just, leadership, and I want to say even the model of what leadership is. Because for me, this idea that there's some hierarchy and one person is supposed to carry that, if you start to change that in terms of shared leadership, you also get greater diversity of ideas and ways to go about that. So I'm thinking about, because I don't use the term outreach anymore, and when thinking about community engagement, and what I'm hearing a lot of you say is, I'm right with you there, is about building a relationship of reciprocity. And so what does a relationship of reciprocity? And you know what? It's going to take longer, but you build that into your research model. Because really, you're thinking long-term. You're thinking about things like compensation. How do we acknowledge? You're building trust, because really, historically, in the science community for the last 400 years, there's a lot of us who just don't trust the science community. That's just real, because we watched that extraction and transaction take place and that appropriation take place and no acknowledgement. And often we're at the losing end. Communities that are considered marginalized are on the losing end. So really, what does it mean to rebuild those relationships? What does it mean to take that time? What does it mean to teach your students how to do that and then give them the freedom to actually do that, along with building the skill set? It's not something that you do on your own time. It's actually part of the actual work that needs to be done. And if they don't get it right, you interrogate that. Right? Sorry, I start getting my voice, I don't know what happens. I'm going to back off.
No, it's passion.
That's fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I was just thinking that one other thing I would add, that since the question was about what the society can do, and I guess society as a sort of community of academic experts, one of the key things I think starting point has to be decentering ourselves as a society or as an expert, and allowing other ways of knowing, other knowledge systems to sort of intersect with ours and learning both ways. Communication. And we've talked about engagement rather than outreach. That's a huge part of it. It has to be a conversation that goes back and forth. It has to build over the long term, definitely. And that in some ways also conflicts with current academic culture, where there's pressures to publish and pressures to produce things, and that productivity treadmill can get in the way of longer term engagement with communities. So we have to, as a society, I think I would challenge the Society for Conservation Biology to also then consider ways in which our academic practices can change to allow for more younger conservation scholars to be able to engage in this kind of meaningful, longer term work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you.
And I also want to build on that. So I would say we need to stop the practice of overstudying and underserving communities. And we need to flip that. We need to start overserving them and understudying them. And that is done delicately. Yes. It's done as it's like not a one size fits all. It's going into communities and saying, this works here, this doesn't work here, this works here. And I think in research, a lot of times researchers view humans as like person they study, and they've taken out the human element of why you wanted to get into your practice in the first place. So I think my answer would be just stopping and flipping the practice of overstudying communities, which we've been doing for so long, and making sure the forefront is serving those communities and bettering those communities.
Yes, thank you, Megan. Overplanned and underdelivered. And, you know, we got to meet people where they are. We got to show up before we're on the agenda. It's about building trust. I'm loving what I'm hearing. So if anybody wanted to add to anything there, otherwise I'm going to shift to this other question we have about reward structures in the system. So, you know, there's a disincentive for institutional and public service in academia. And folks who are trying to do the social justice work have this kind of double whammy. They still held to the publisher parish, but they have this drive for social benefit work, and there is a need for this. So, you know, do you have any ideas about how we might shift the reward structure of the Academy that would help support diversity, equity, inclusion, and conservation?
Oh yes, can I say something? So, you know, this is public knowledge, but I walked away from academia 2 years ago because of this very issue. I spent 11 years at 2 different institutions that had recruited me and then made certain promises and agreements, but also kept trying to shrink how I do this kind of work. The idea that if I want to have any integrity in what I do, everything everyone's saying to you, you're always trying to practice, what does that look like? That there wasn't space for it in the Academy. But that didn't mean I didn't want to work with people in academia, right? So that's the thing. And so I think part of it is, and this won't be for everyone, but I think we have to think more broadly about what different models are out there for those of us doing this work and wanting to be with academia. The only reason I'm here in Middlebury, I spent 6 months with the Dean of the Environmental Center saying, let's work out a proposal, because I said, don't give me another full-time faculty position and tell me that you think that I'm going to be able to do what I'm going to do. Because I said, no, let's decide right up front on paper what that's going to be. Let's put a time limit on it. We can create these things, you know, so that it serves both ends. So part of it is, how do we make space for building those relationships within the Academy? Because there are a lot of good people that sit in positions of power that may just need a little nudge to say, you know, have you considered, like, we might be able to think of this a different way. I don't want to demonize the Academy. I got a lot of issues with the Academy, but I also don't want to demonize it because I've been privileged to go through it at the same time. So it's something about what's happening internally that we can consider, instead of, you know, and not only looking at all those things about citationality and tenure and all of those ways that we get locked into saying, oh, well, I'm not going to do those things I really want to do because I want to keep my job. How do we think about it as work as opposed to simply a job? Understanding, I know we got to pay our rent.
So, hi, I'm Rebecca Toniato. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Michigan Flint, and I work with my amazing community partner, Megan Haza, on the Porch Project. So I do the pollinator study she mentioned in one of her examples. And for me, the assistant professor part is especially to say pre-tenure part. And this is actually something Megan and I do trainings on together and talking with early career researchers about how to frame this. So it's this win-win and also win for the community. Because as you can imagine, we have extremely different ways in which we need to show what we're doing to either the people who gave us funding or the people who are telling us, yes, you keep moving on, you keep moving on. So for me, I don't call this service. This is not service. This is community engaged research. And Megan and I started this, like, we sat down at a table together. Like, Megan had the Porch Project as her idea. This thing to add pollinators was from a conversation we sat down together and developed. It wasn't me coming with a plan. It wasn't me coming with a grant and saying I need this many sites. We developed something together cohesively. And so when I report this back in my documents, I'll be totally honest. I know this is now going to live forever on YouTube, and that's totally fine. But I mirror the mission statement of my university. We talk about being engaged. We are a Carnegie engaged campus at the University of Michigan Flint. It's something we are proud of. This is not outreach. This is not service. This is engaged research. And when I go out in the community, I have my undergrad students with me, or undergrad students in my lab. They aren't my undergrad students. And for example, our paper coming out of the Porch Project is an undergraduate first author. Megan Kate found something super cool about sunlight. So for me, it honestly is a little bit of kind of playing the game and making sure that you're able to tick those boxes. But to me, this is research. This is where I'm focusing pre-tenure. And if that's not okay, then I don't want to be there.
So I wanted to loop in Deja on, because you're a current student, so is Suzanne. And how does looking out at the landscape for you and the reward structures in place come across? You know, how does that impact the work that you do and how you think about your career?
Yeah, it is. It's hard because being in the academic space, a lot of times, a lot of the burden is put on students of color to do a lot of this work. So we have to be students, we have to be researchers, we have to be community engagers, we have to be DEI specialists, we have to be all of these things. And there really is, like you all were saying, no reward structure set up. And I think that it would be really beneficial if a lot of universities would set up some type of scholarship or some type of fund to show that this type of work is important. You know, it's important to the community, it's important to the university. And I think that one of the huge problems, of course, like we don't have that now. And a lot of times, like we're doing all of this work, wearing all of these different hats. And, you know, it's like, oh, well, how come you didn't do this poster session? How come you didn't publish this paper? How come you didn't do this? And so on the student side of things, it really does seem like the priorities aren't matching up for what the demand is. And I think that it's important, and one of the huge problems that we have is that a lot of the professors are not training their students about, you know, what's the right way to do science, or what's the, you know, how do we engage with communities, or what are the priorities? Because, you know, from the student perspective, we're getting trained. So doing our master's, doing our PhD, we're being molded and shaped in the way of our advisors. So I can only, you know, my view of how to do science and what's important and the priorities are going to be based off of who I'm working with and what my goals are, but also how, you know, the relationship with my advisor and the things that they're showing me that are important for a role of a scientist.
Yep. And, you know, I often say when I'm working with folks who do funding, it's like, one, you need to allow grant applications to have line items for community engagement, and they need to be fairly flexible. And moreover, you can't be handing out grants to people who are talking about doing community science or community engagement where it's completely unfeasible for them to do that work for real and in a legitimate and authentic and sensitive way on the line item that they put, you know. So thank you for that. And I would also like to say, you know, centering people of color, which is what we need to do, does not mean tokenizing them into doing all the work for us, right? So I wanted to make sure I touched on, you know, Talia, you talked about, you know, you're obviously not going out into these communities of fishermen, given your background. And, you know, I wanted to bring up, how does the role of intersectionality, combined forces of race and gender, orientation, ethnicity, immigrant status, all of the layers, the dimensions of diversity that all of us hold, you know, how does that play in diversifying conservation and making conservation efforts successful? Anyone can speak to this, because we are not, you know, we contain multitudes. Any thoughts?
Say that last piece again, Sean. Ask the question again.
How does the role of intersectionality play in diversifying conservation? What do we need to be thinking about in terms of the intersectionality of that all of us have, the dimensions of diversity? You know, just as an example, on the flip side, often when you talk to conservation organizations, they're like, we're incredibly diverse. You know, we're 75% women.
Yeah.
That's a classic cop-out.
Yeah.
But Any thoughts whatsoever?
Well, something that you said, Sean, I mean, first of all, for me, we're all intersectional. We all have multiple forms of identity when we show up somewhere. And certain forms of identity are privileged over others. Certain forms of identity are visible over others. So for me, part of it is I go back to that, what does it mean in terms of wholeness? So when we think about the work that we do, the way we do our work, our writing, our methodology, what our epistemology is, the cosmology, whatever, the theory, everything that we're engaging, how are we intersectional about that? How do we recognize the value? So it's not, the ways of knowing are not placed in a hierarchy. There's something about how different forms of my identity inform me in different ways, right? Sometimes I might shift over here because of this and I shift over there because of that. Does the frameworks allow me to have that flexibility and then allow anyone that I may be learning from and working with to have the same flexibility? And how are we able to call that out and not have that diminished? How can we be rigorous about that? How do we work across difference? What does that mean to work across difference so that we can create a third space of emergence, which then allows something new to come up? How do we build that skill set? What does that look like?
Mm-hmm. And it just all comes back down to love, compassion, empathy. You have to understand difference and actually want to learn and employ that in order to bring all these voices in and to recognize your own implicit biases. As you pointed out, I'm a cisgendered male. I have all sorts of privilege that come along with that. I also have all sorts of disadvantages because of the color of my skin that I've had to pursue. But once we have that perspective, we can truly start to align our motivations because we boil it all down to our fundamental needs, values, desires. Everyone loves their children. Chris, were you going to pop in there?
Yeah, I was just going to add that this idea of intersectionality is quintessential to, I think, how we work and how we perform our science. And if I may, just to use another analogy, think about, say, all the differences in the diversity on this panel, but just the diversity of scientists that do the work. As conservation biologists, we always think about biodiversity and how systems that have greater biodiversity perform better, they're healthier, right? So why would we expect, and this is at every level, whether it comes from how we evaluate each other as scientists to who's in the room making the decisions, why would we expect that having a monoculture of different peoples, like all act the same, be healthy in any system? That makes no sense as a conservation biologist. Again, right, we could think about the term connectivity. Like if we're thinking about how segregation influences different neighborhoods, so certain groups of people never interact with each other, that's like creating different barriers to wildlife too. It degrades connectivity to the point that we degrade gene flow. As a conservation biologist, intersectionality means you are challenged to think beyond the bounds of the science that you were taught. Because the science that you were taught was rooted in white supremacy. Hell, everything you were taught since you were a baby, if you lived in America, was rooted in white supremacy.
Yes.
So as a result, we need to rethink everything.
Yes.
And I say that literally because, quite literally, our planet is in jeopardy, right? Like climate change, biodiversity. I've talked to people about this until I'm blue in the face. The science matches what we're seeing. Inequality in cities shows that those cities have greater biodiversity loss. They have greater biodiversity loss. If we're conservation biologists and we care about saving our planet, we got to start being activists like yesterday. And it's got to be consistent. Don't give up because you get tired. It's like being in a football game, right? Like if you're a center, okay, you play offense for a little bit, you get a breather, you get some Gatorade, you get your ass back on the field, right? This game is long. It's going to take a lot of time. So work on it. Get conditioned. Do what you got to do.
And like you said, monoculture is fragile. Preach. Yeah, and so I think, unfortunately, we're just getting warmed up. But I wanted to say, hopefully there's interest in continuing this conversation. I want to put a plug in for maybe bringing back at least some of you, and we can figure out a way to do some interactive webinar or something if the folks at the conference are interested. Because this is, like I said, we are just scratching the surface. But I think, unfortunately, we're going to need to wrap it up. And I wanted to briefly tie together, though, all these themes. And like you said, it is work, but and as everybody's mentioned, this stuff takes longer. That's the reason why it always gets pushed off the end of the table, but it's infinitely more powerful and durable and responsive and flexible and resilient because of the diversity of opinions. You know, increasing diversity in nature is not easy, but we know that it creates a more durable and perpetual and sustainable system. So, you know, these elements of you know, the debates that we've talked about, what we've not discussed today, none of this is new. Elements of it before have been there: conservationist versus preservationist, intrinsic versus instrumental value, people versus nature. But the lack of progress on diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice in the conservation and environmental movements is not an academic or philosophical argument, and it's limiting our ability to achieve our conservation goals. So again, fundamentally, if this is our goal, then we're not succeeding at it, and we need to recognize that. And you know, the Herculean efforts of the people of color on this call and the staunch white allies on this Zoom, you know, are showing us how we can advance both social justice and conservation, and why we need to. Caroline, you're talking about we are human beings, not human doings. I love that. Representation matters, and just because you don't understand the value does not mean it's not valuable.
Right.
If you're not comfortable, I mean, if you're comfortable, you're not doing the work. Madhu, you talked about you know, calling for a Truth and Reconciliation Commission for conservation to irrigate the wounds caused by colonial conservation. Suzanne, your living testament that traditional ecological knowledge is a standalone knowledge system with its own epistemology. You know, it's been in continuous development for 10,000 years before Karl Popper was potty trained. Megan, you urged researchers to distinguish between outreach and engagement. That community engagement is about meeting people where they are. Scientists need to check themselves to prevent the extractive approach that is default of traditional research science. Talia, you demonstrated that the power of creating community, you know, the power of creating community through Philadelphia, aligning the interests and needs of disparate sectors and cultural communities is how we benefit everyone. And Max, Deja, and Chris, in that kind of full loop circle talk there, you laid out how Jim Crow era institutional racism maintains and deepens these nature, wealth, and health gaps in the US, and how this in turn limits conservation. So you brought it all the way back home. You know, Aldo Leopold said, and I like, Madhu, that you quoted Leopold there. This is a different one. Being an ecologist is like being a doctor who sees the marks of death in a community that believes itself well and does not want to be told otherwise. This is how I felt about DEI in conservation for decades. Yeah. This unbearable whiteness of being that's invisible, that is seen as separate or moral, i.e. not scientific, and therefore not something we need to discuss by so many conservationists and practitioners and scientists. And the partnerships that result from that culture are so often transactional instead of trust building, zero sum instead of synergistic, individualistic instead of cooperative. And again, this is not an insult, it's simply an observation. And this is a challenge for the heart and soul of conservation. This is how we were going to succeed, actually have a 21st century conservation. And you, my esteemed colleagues, are cutting a path forward. I hope that the audience and the leadership are seeing how this needs to be supported and celebrated and built upon, and that takes pushing away the obstacles that make it so difficult for this kind of work to happen. So again, thank all of you, the panelists, our sponsors, Conservation Science Partners and the Smith Fellows Program, to Society of Conservation Biology for providing the opportunity to just kickstart this conversation again. And thanks to all of you out there in Zoom land for joining us on this for this plenary. For those of you whose questions weren't asked, know that again, these questions are going to be submitted to the SCB leadership, so they will at least be captured. And stay tuned. Like I said, this is just getting started. Please blow us up on the tweeters and with the hashtag inclusive conservation, and hope to see you again soon, hopefully in person. I want to give a hug to everybody.
Yeah.
So we'll just have to do
right.
this. All right.
Hugs.
Take care. Thanks again.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.